Hello everybody, Raven Knight here. I really hope this is the last time I respond to Bookfox, really. I really hope that I don't have to come back and do another one of these. Not because I don't like the guy or anything, but the responses I've been getting aren't always the best. Look, okay, I want to make this clear before we go further. I don't hate the guy, nor am I really out to get him necessarily. I'm not saying he's even wrong most of the time in a lot of his bits of advice. In his videos about common mistakes made when writing men, women, and children, I was simply trying to apply some context or alternative scenarios in which the rules had exceptions, or just pointing out where I thought he might have made a blunder or an area where I slightly disagreed. That's it. I'm not here to be a jerk, and that's still the same case here. Because in this video, Bookfox is here to share 9 golden rules to write addictive animal characters, or at least so the title says. So, let's take a look at this. I think this is the last video of this type that we're going to look at from Bookfox. Let's see what his 9 rules for writing addictive animal characters are. Normally I change out to another avatar when I do this. Do I have an image of me as an animal? I don't think so. I'll just use this. All right, let's go.
Putting an animal into your story is one of the best things you can do. Just think of all the popularity of cat videos on social media and news organizations, saluting dogs who rescued humans. I mean, animals create waves, animals attract attention. People love animals, so why not have an animal in your book?
Wait, hold on. Are you saying that animals are wonderful ideas to add purely because they can draw in readers? Okay. I won't disagree with that, but I'm going to tack on a warning to that piece of advice. A little warning. If your story isn't about this animal, if that animal is not a major part of the story, but the animal is the only thing drawing in readers, you have a really serious issue with your story. Like, if your story is only going to hinge on the arrival of an animal, and that animal is not even crucial to the story's plot, you may have a problem. Just saying. Okay, carry on.
Now in this video, we're not going to be talking about books where all the characters are animals, like Watership Down or Animal Farm. And we're also not talking about books where the main character is an animal, like The Art of Racing in the Rain or Jack London's White Fang. What we're talking about is human-centric stories where an animal plays a part. We're going to talk about 10 animal writing lessons that you can learn from famous authors. And pay attention until the end because the last 4 are the advanced techniques.
10? Wait, 10? The title of the video says 9. Huh. Okay, well, that's fine. I'm not good at math either.
Let's start with number 1, use animals to progress your plot. If you're struggling to find a way to make certain plot elements in your book really work, then you might need an animal to grease the wheels. Let's look at The Wizard of Oz by Frank Baum and the little dog Toto. Toto is absolutely essential for the entire plot of this book. In the beginning, he is the reason that the story starts. They are going to euthanize him, and so that's why Dorothy runs away. Toto's also the one that makes the climax work because he's the one that escapes the castle and brings the Tin Man and Scarecrow and Cowardly Lion to Dorothy. And in the end, Toto's also the one that makes Dorothy miss the hot air balloon, which ends up leading her to discover the power of the red shoes. Without Toto, the whole storyline of this book and movie don't work. So I would just recommend that you look at your own story to try to figure out ways where an animal could affect the plot in some way.
So my issue with this criticism is it sounds like the advice is if you're having trouble getting the plot of your story going, insert an animal to get it rolling. This advice isn't necessarily bad, but it sounds almost like what I would call band-aid advice, and amateur authors are going to treat it that way. Toto in The Wizard of Oz was not just hastily thrown in to get the plot going. He had relevance and purpose from beginning to end. The author clearly planned for each of these events with Toto to take place. It's highly unlikely he was scratching his head at some point going, "Oh, damn, this plot just isn't going anywhere. What do I do? The dog," and then added in Toto. He likely planned everything from the start. But some authors will hear this advice and go, "Oh, so that's why I can't get my story started. I better throw in an animal to kick things off." And that can be disastrous, especially if the animal plays no role in later aspects of the story and their involvement now throws a few monkey wrenches into things. Now, I want to restate here, you're not wrong, and I'm not saying that Bookfox is wrong in this advice. This is a warning to amateur authors who took his advice and said, "Oh, so if I'm having a lot of trouble starting my story, I just need to insert random animal X in there." No. Don't do that. Don't treat this as band-aid advice. An animal can be an excellent use to get a plot going or to continue a plot or to even carry a plot. You can do a lot with that. Like Because of Winn-Dixie, Old Yeller, a lot of these stories rely on the animal to really get things going. Charlotte's Web, for Pete's sake, an excellent one. The story could not be told without Wilbur and Charlotte, or, Templeton. You couldn't have the story without these characters. But if you just say, oh man, my story's not doing so good, and let me just throw in a dog in there, or a kitty cat, and that'll get things going, that's not the way to do it. Again, I don't disagree. Just making sure that everyone understands not to just treat this as Band-Aid advice. Okay, carry on.
The second thing we have to learn is use animals to characterize your humans. There's this old screenwriting advice that says, if you want to establish who your heroes and villains are, have your heroes save a cat and have your villains kick a puppy. They give that advice because how your characters treat animals reveals so much about who they are as a person. Let's look at All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy. John Grady Cole is this rough and tumble cowboy, but when he interacts with Redbow, his horse, we see this tender, gentle side of him come out. And if that relationship with that horse didn't exist, then he wouldn't be as fully rounded or as likable as a character. I mean, look at these two quotes. Like, as he's riding his horse, he's just talking to his horse, telling it about the things he thinks are true. And then in another quote, he says, he thinks about horses, and it was always the right thing to think about, which is the most cowboyish line ever, I think. Now, while we're on characterization, I should also mention that you need to do characterization work on the animal in your story too. They can't just be a formless, vague, like representative of a dog or a cat or a horse. They need personality. They need to seem different from other animals.
Yeah, no argument there. I agree with this. Your animal is a character too. If you're going to involve an animal in your story, remember the animal is a character. Even Hedwig in Harry Potter was given something of a personality. Give them a personality or a persona. In my story, Revenant King, Detective Kim goes home to her cat, who she does describe as being affectionate but spoiled, and I have the cat behave that way. Your animals and your humans should have some form of interaction, and it should be easy for an audience member to digest. I 100% agree. Yep.
The third way that you can use animals in your story is to make animals provide character motivation. There is some old screenwriting advice that says, never kill the dog. No matter what you do, don't kill the dog. You can have people dying like flies in apocalyptic scenarios, but like, keep the dog alive. You'll make people very angry if you kill the dog. But sometimes anger is the actual point. I think of John Wick when they killed his dog. What does he do? Oh, he goes on a rampage and kills like 300 different people. And in many ways, the death of his dog launches the entire 4-movie franchise. I mean, can you imagine the John Wick storyline without his dog dying? It's central to the plot. Now, obviously, you don't need to have an animal die to provide character motivation. It could be that an animal needs cataract surgery or something, and a character needs to come up with money to provide that for them. It could be a very, heartwarming story. But because people love animals so much, it creates extremely powerful motivation for your characters.
I mean, well, yes, but isn't this literally just your first point? Your first point of advice was to use animals to progress the plot. This one is use animals to be a character motivation. Well, motivating the character into action is a form of plot progression. This is just the same point from before, isn't it? Just more centralized? I mean, Toto, you brought up Toto from The Wizard of Oz. Toto was going to be euthanized, and that motivated Dorothy to run away. That got the plot going. It's the same thing. I don't disagree with the point, but you could have just added this onto your first point. Like, really? Someone tell me if I'm wrong. Doesn't this sound exactly like his first point?
The fourth tip that's going to help us write animals into our story is use animals to tug at our emotions. The first book that made me cry was a book about dogs. I'm sure a lot of you have read it. It's Where the Red Fern Grows. Billy gets 2 coonhounds, Old Dan and Little Ann. And by the end of that story, I mean, if you haven't read it, I don't want to spoil it for you, but by the end of that story, I was in my bedroom in the high desert of California, bawling my eyes out, like crying as I had never cried before. It's a heartbreaking story. But that's what animals can do to you, right? Like, we love animals so much. So you don't just want those animals affecting your character, you also want those animals affecting your reader's emotions as well. Here's another example from A Man Called Uwe by Frederick Bachman. So Uwe goes to his late wife's grave and he kind of like breaks down as he's talking to her. And in that moment, the cat, which he calls the cat annoyance because he's super grumpy, comes and just lays its head on his palm as if to comfort him. And it's such a sweet moment that really makes you feel like, oh yeah, this is what animals do for us. They comfort us in our darkest moments.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Animals resonate with us. That's why we love touching animal videos and documentaries. Dogs and cats are cute. Bonds with animals are something very beautiful. However, the thing to bear in mind that was not mentioned is that you have to set this up correctly. You can't just throw in a dog dying and expect your audience to give a shit just because a dog died. You have to establish a relationship with the dog and the reader. Where the Red Fern Grows did this exquisitely. Imagine, though, if the dogs were just thrown in at the last moment and died, or we hadn't journeyed with them through the majority of the book. It wouldn't have made you cry that much. If you want your animal bonds to tug at heartstrings, you need to take the time to let the animal get close to the heart, and that will require careful writing. Again, I'm not disagreeing with your point. I'm not disagreeing with Bookfox here, guys. What I'm saying is there are going to be some writers, and believe me, as someone who's given writing advice before, I know that there are people out there who take advice as Band-Aid advice. Like, they'll say, what can I do to make my story better? I'll offer advice, and then they'll just slap something very simple on it, like, oh, my parent died, or oh, he bought a dog, or oh, he got a disease, and then just assume that fixes everything. No, you have to sew it into the tapestry. You have to integrate it properly. You know what I'm saying? I'm not saying you can't use this. You can use animals to tug at heartstrings, but if you don't carefully write it in, if you don't carefully apply it, it's going to come off as cheap. If you just say, oh man, this story really isn't getting emotional, let's throw in a few dead dogs. The minute you do that, you've gotten cheap response. You've made darkness for darkness' sake, and that to me is not good.
A fifth way that you can use animals inside your story is to create leverage for the antagonist. So if you have an antagonist that needs to be pressuring your main character in some way, that needs to be attacking them in some way, but it's too early in the book for them to attack your protagonist physically, then oftentimes having your antagonist attack a proxy of your character, like a pet of theirs, works really well. Let's look at Harry Potter's Hedwig, which is a snowy owl. So Dolores Umbridge is sort of the antagonist of Harry in one of the books, and when she is intercepting letters, she ends up intercepting the letters from Hedwig, but ends up injuring the owl in the process. Now what this does is it really inflames the reader's emotions, making them even more angry at Dolores Umbridge. Because what kind of monster hurts an animal? Especially Hedwig. For another example of this, think of a story like 101 Dalmatians, where the main antagonist, their main goal is kidnapping all these dogs, and the intent is to make a coat out of them. I mean, that's such a horrible, horrible thing to do, Cruella. But once again, we more fully understand the depravity of the antagonist when we see what they're doing to these animals of the main character.
Okay, this is your second point repeated, but again, framed more strictly. Your second point was use animals to characterize your humans. You even mentioned at the beginning the old screenwriting advice, have your heroes save a cat, have your villains kick a puppy. This is that. This is just that. This is exactly that. You're saying that you can show the depravity and evil of your villains by having them harm animals. In short terms, kick the puppy. Bruh. This is just your second point repeated, but with a more narrow focus. Again, I don't disagree with the point, but I already agreed with you on this earlier. Yes, you can use your villains to hurt animals to show even more villainy from them. You can characterize your villain through an animal, just like you said in your second point. Am I crazy? Am I crazy, guys, for acknowledging that it looks like he's repeating his points?
A sixth thing you can do with animals in your story is to use animals for comic relief. If there is anything that we have learned from social media, it is that animals are really truly funny. I could honestly list tens of millions of examples of this, but just for now, we're going to look at one story, Dr. Evil's hairless cat in Austin Powers, Mr. Bigglesworth. So Mr. Bigglesworth has lost all of his hair in the reanimation process, and the way that Dr. Evil interacts with Mr. Bigglesworth throughout the entire movie is actually hilarious, including like the crazy way that Mini-Me reacts to him. He tries to eat Mr. Bigglesworth and he has to be reproved.
No, we don't gnaw on our kitty.
But if you have a chance to throw a little bit of humor in your book with a dog or a cat or a parrot or whatever animal doing something funny, it's gonna tickle the funny bone of the reader and win you huge brownie points in your book.
I 100% agree. Animals can be used for great comedic effect. In fact, that's often the reason they're added in stories, is for comedic interlude or distraction. Again, nothing really wrong with this. You can totally do that. I would, again, caution, make sure it integrates well into the story. Like if you have a animal that you wouldn't necessarily expect to be of comedic origin, don't suddenly make them papa funny, you know, but that's neither here nor there. This is fine advice.
Now for these last 4 points, we're gonna look at some more advanced techniques that you can use in your story. Starting with number 7, animals as symbols. Probably a lot of you have read To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, and we have 2 animal symbols in this book. One is the one in the title, the mockingbird. Atticus Finch tells his children it's a sin to kill a mockingbird because a mockingbird does nothing wrong. It just makes music for people to enjoy. So the mockingbird in the story really represents a character who is innocent. And therefore it's wrong to kill Tom Robinson, who's falsely accused of raping this white woman, because he is one of those innocents. He's like a mockingbird. On the other hand, the rabid town dog, Tim Johnson, which is a funny name for a dog, but whatever, is a symbol of racism. The dog becomes rabid and wanders around town threatening to bite people, and in the end, Atticus actually has to shoot it. And the rabid dog really represents all the racist town people. So I said this was an advanced technique, and I think now you see why. But I want you to think about animals in your book and what they can symbolize for the reader. Do they symbolize innocence? Do they symbolize anger? You can make an animal symbolize quite a lot.
All right, so my old literary professor once said this about symbolism, quote, "A stop sign in the middle of the woods is still a symbol, but it has no purpose being there and is ultimately worthless. It's going to do little more than distract and confuse people." I agree wholeheartedly with the advice you're giving, Bookfox, but I would add this onto it. Do not try to make symbols for the sake of making a symbol. If you're one of those people who wants to make your book feel deeper by making every single tree in the forest some kind of symbol for oppression or innocence or truth or whatever, you're not only going to get lost in your own sauce, but you're going to look pretentious and your book will suffer. I think To Kill a Mockingbird is a beautiful example of both. The mockingbird symbolism is excellent. Well done. It's clear, easy to understand, and applies well to the scenario. But the dog Tom Robinson, the rabid dog being a symbol of racism in society, I mean, yeah, I see how it's symbolic of that, and I can see how it fits, but at the same time, I can't help but scratch my head and wonder, was that symbolism truly necessary? I honestly was never taught that about the dog. I don't remember at any point in my classroom did anyone ever point out to me, oh yeah, and the dog was a symbol of racism. I always assumed what that scene was for was to demonstrate to the children the lengths that their father, Atticus Finch, will go to keep others safe. He's not a man who relishes death, but is willing to apply it for the good of the community, for the good of others. He is willing to go that step. He's willing to do what others won't, which explains why he was defending the defendant, which explains why he does the things he does. I mean, again, I see how it is. I see what you're saying. I see how it's a symbol for racism. I can see the writing there. I can see how that conclusion was drawn. But my question is, what does it add? What do we take from it? That racism is destructive and must be put down for the good of the community? Could this story have existed without that symbolism involved? I kind of assumed the point of the story in the first place was about the evils of racism, but I think the mockingbird symbol is far more impactful, as it doesn't just speak directly to a moral, but to a thematic point of innocence. But that's just my opinion. You know, it still works as a symbol. It still works. So I'm not going to say he's wrong here. He's definitely right. But in my opinion, and this is from my perspective, please keep that in mind. When writing a character or animal as a symbol, if you get too caught up in, oh, look at all my symbols, it's so deep, and you start turning into a conspiracy theorist trying to point at every single thing in your book about how it's this symbol or that symbol, it's kind of like people who try to defend the sequel series of Star Wars by trying to say, oh, but look at the symbolism of this, or the themes of this, or the metaphors in this, and then they just point at every little thing, even things that do not matter at the end of the day, and just try to say, look at how it symbolizes that. It gets pretentious, it gets old, and people start to think you're trying to apply depth where there is none, and it looks really dumb. I'm not saying that's the case here, and I'm not saying To Kill a Mockingbird is dumb. Not at all. I love To Kill a Mockingbird. Great book. Great movie, too, if you've seen it. But my only point is, if you're going to write symbols into your story, make sure that you do it with care. Everything with care. Don't do it just, you know what? I feel like getting deep. Symbol, 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 and then just go down the list. Now, use symbols sparingly, but effectively. That would be my advice. Okay, carry on.
For the 8th way to incorporate animals into your story, let's look at animals as metaphors. So a lot of what we've talked about in this video so far is animals as a minor character in your story. But what if you just want an animal to play sort of a cameo role? You might know Barbara Kingsolver because she's written books like Demon Copperhead and also the Poisonwood Bible. But for this one, we're going to draw from one of her lesser known novels, The Bean Trees. In this book, there is a 3-year-old foster child who is being x-rayed at the doctor's, and the foster mom realizes that he has all these healed broken bones in his body. And she doesn't want to think about all the horrors that he's endured. So what she does instead is she looks out the window and she sees this tiny little bird flying around all the spikes of a cactus and into the cactus where it has a nest in there. And she doesn't make this explicit, but I think it's such a wonderful metaphor for what this child must have endured. This frail little bird of a child who, even when living in a cactus, right, in the cactus of domestic abuse and violence, finds a little nest and tries to survive in that situation. Now, as an author, if you think about what else Barbara Kingsolver could have done, she could have had the mom imagine very explicitly, perhaps, the violence that that child endured. But she didn't want to be that direct. She didn't want to be that explicit. Instead, she resorts to metaphor with an animal to symbolize what that child went through. So your goal might be to find an animal that reflects what your character has experienced. And here's one final example of this. In Frederick Buechner's Lion Country, there's a character whose twin sister is dying. Now, it's just too painful for him to deal with his sister dying. So what he does instead is he talks about a cat of his who is also dying. The cat's health struggles are a way to talk about his sister's health struggles, but talk about it in code.
I guess, yeah, but I mean, okay, I see what you're saying here, but isn't this kind of another version of symbolism? I don't know, I won't nitpick this one too hard. Like, treating animals as metaphors for plights and situations in the story is a little different from direct symbolism, I guess, but I mean, I'll accept it, but I'd also say this is a very unconventional technique. You don't see this done all that often. I mean, it can be done, yeah. You know what, move on. I'm fine with this one, move on.
Now let's get to number 9, which is animals as spiritual guides. Animals quite often are more than mere animals. They can rise to the level of representative of some sort of spiritual reality. An obvious example of this would be in C.S. Lewis's Narnia series. You have the character of Aslan, who's a lion, and he's very obviously a Christ figure, to the point where he ends up being sacrificed as a substitute to save one of the human characters. Or you have a book like The Master and the Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. In that book, you have an enormous black cat called Behemoth, and this character is very much like representative of a demon. He's a very funny character, yes, but ultimately a very dark and negative spiritual presence. And lastly, let's look at J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter. Think of Harry's Patronus, the stag. The stag symbolizes protection and guidance. It almost plays a kind of supernatural role in protecting him, kind of like a guardian angel would.
Okay. Yes, you're right. Animals can definitely be used as spiritual guides or spiritual points. I totally agree. And it's a creative way to use animals in your story, but your examples are kind of funny. Aslan in Narnia is more than a spiritual guide. He's a direct allegory to Jesus. In fact, in one of the books, he even says, "In your world, I have another name." He's not just a Christ figure. He's Christ. And then the stag for Harry Potter. The reason his Patronus takes the form of a stag is because it's what his father was able to turn into. It's more than just a symbol or symbol of protection or a guardian angel. It's literally supposed to be representative of his father, but that's just nitpicking. Nothing wrong with what was said. Carry on.
For our last and final point, let's look at animals as mirrors. So the role of a lot of animals in books or stories is simply to provide a mirror or to reflect what their human character actually is like. In Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy O'Toole, there is a dog who is so slovenly and lazy. And the main character, Ignatius J. Riley, comments on that and says like, oh, this is obviously my pet. He's exactly like me. So having a pet that's exactly like your main character is another way to characterize that character indirectly. In Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Love in the Time of Cholera, we also see a parrot, and the parrot's high intelligence really mirrors the owner's high intelligence. Or maybe some of you have thought of this already, George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, we have dire wolves, and the dire wolves have this deep connection, almost mirroring the Stark children. Each direwolf is pivotal to the Stark children's identity and fate, and the direwolves really reflect the personality of these kids and these mystical aspects of the North. If you don't yet have an animal in your book, now is the time to add one. I hope one of these ideas helped stir up your imagination.
Okay, again, this is just your second point, just again more narrowed. Your second point was to use animals to characterize your humans, but having the animals mirror their owners or humans, they are characterizing them. Just, friend, you could have made this like 6 points instead of 10, even though your video title says 9. But again, math isn't our strong suit as writers, right? So I'll forgive you for that. But okay, we're done. We're all wrapped up. We're finished. Okay, so I'm going to say this about Bookfox, and after this, I think I'm done responding to the guy, unless he releases something that I can actually really come down on him on. His advice overall, I don't think is bad. He makes a lot of good points, and there are some things there that I think a lot of young writers or up-and-coming writers can take and really apply. My only concern when looking at his videos, I have two concerns. The first concern is that a lot of young writers or amateur writers are going to listen to what he says and go, oh, yeah, and then just use Band-Aid reasoning or Band-Aid effects. And Band-Aid fixes are basically where you just slap something on to try to cover a plot hole or cover up an error you've made. Like, for example, in this whole thing where he's saying, like, you can use an animal to be a major plot point in a story. What if you have an author who never planned to add an animal, and now they're going to add one just to kick off the plot, but they have no idea how to integrate the animal into the story? That could be a problem. And of course, someone's going to say, of course he was meaning that, Raven. That's what he was talking about. Yes, I'm sure it was, but you have to consider there are some people out there who do not have that natural inclination to writing, who will just assume, oh, okay, dog. And then that's all they do. They just throw in something and then they think that that's enough. It's not enough. You've got to be careful with how you write things. Writing a story is like writing a tapestry or stitching something, or stitching a quilt or painting a picture. Things have to flow. They have to attach naturally. You need to be careful that people don't see, let them see the stitching, but don't let them see the errors in your stitching. Don't let a sharp contrast distract the audience. It's going to be off-putting. So you have to be careful. And so all I'm doing in these videos is I'm just trying to say, let me give a little bit further to these. I don't think any of them were egregiously bad, nor do I think any of them were outstandingly awful. Some of them could have been better, and in this one, I really do think it could have been a lot shorter, and I don't get why he said the title was 9 things, but instead he listed 10 things, and 3 of those 10 things were just repeats of previous points. I don't think this one was well planned. I think this one, you know what, I'll be honest, I think he was really looking for 10 things to say and just started repeating himself at some points. But anyway, that's my thought on this. If you guys enjoy his work, go check out his stuff. If you enjoy my work, subscribe if you like it. And I think this is the last time I'll be responding to Bookfox. Hopefully next time I do a response video, it'll be to someone else and someone I can really go off on. But anyway, thank you guys so much. I will see you in my next video. Take care.